People are becoming more and more anxious. More than a third of us feel the world is a more frightening place than it used to be.
By age 32, 50% of the population might qualify for an anxiety disorder.
For an estimated 10 million Americans, fear of social situations can be totally debilitating.
I'm a 40-year-old man in a 12-year-old body.
One of my friends said, for people like you, we used to pour buckets of cold water on them as they lay in bed. That's what you deserve.
If they can fix their anxiety with a pill, that's just as appealing as discovering that you can make your dinner with a microwave oven.
The country is bathing itself in prescribed drugs.
Well, there are many, many unhappy people out there in the real world. They don't all have psychiatric illnesses. The ultimate risk now is that we've psychiatrized the entire population. We've ended up in a situation where virtually everybody has some kind of disorder. That's crazy.
The number one prescription people come to the pharmacy for is anxiety. Wouldn't you say about 3/4 of what we have here is for anxiety, Mark? Well, 3/4 of the things in the pharmacy are for anxiety. It's kind of a sad thing. It's a tragic thing, really.
This is a story about a society on edge. A place where our culture, the very way we live, is leaving us feeling more anxious than ever before.
We're normally anxious because life is dangerous. Many of us are vulnerable to losing a job or being underemployed. We can't manage whether we're going to get a disease or not most of the time.
The other factor I think is really important is isolation. So that sense that really nobody does have your back. The collapse of meaning, so that, where we all used to sort of, trudge off to the same church, and even if we didn't explicitly believe in God, we had a general consensus about it. Now we have none of that, so that's very anxiety-provoking.
Once considered an obscure and serious illness, anxiety is now a big part of our cultural identity.
18% of the US population is said to have an anxiety disorder. So that's pretty high. Certainly higher than depression, higher than bipolar disorder, higher than schizophrenia.
Modern life is taking its toll. Anxiety about terrorism, increasing fear of crime.
More than a third of us.
You can't avoid hearing about anxiety if you're in a media sophisticated setting.
66% say the economy is contributing to our fears.
And I think in a setting like that, we become socialized to those ideas.
All over the world, a sort of psychiatric perfect storm has been brewing. New diagnoses for anxiety, prescription-happy GPs, and a hectic society have all collided in the early 21st century to effectively turn us all into mental health patients.
More and more people who have normal worry and anxiety are being diagnosed as having a mental disorder.
It's become extraordinarily prevalent in our culture as a reference point for how we're all feeling without us necessarily understanding what it is that we're talking about.
What has changed? Or has anxiety always been with us and only now taking its place in the cultural spotlight? To answer that question, we need to know, what exactly is anxiety?
So often there's a confusion in the minds of people when they're speaking. When they're talking about anxiety, they're talking about something normal? Are they talking about something extra normal? They're talking about something pathological? Is it a disease? Is it a symptom?
The dictionary describes it as a feeling of worry, nervousness, or unease, typically about an imminent event or something with an uncertain outcome. In reality, it means very different things to different people.
A welling up of what I used to call panic juice. I know that sounds weird, but it felt like there was this volcano of panic juice coming from the stomach and then into the rest of me.
It kind of feels like something's always chasing you, that you are always trying to get away or always trying to get somewhere. There's something always right behind you, coming for you.
It's just something your brain does to you. It's something you see that triggers the brain, like the alarm, it goes off. Wee, wee. I thought my heart was stopping. I'm gonna not lie to you, I thought my heart was stopping and I thought I was dying. That may sound a little like crazy, but I'm not lying.
It's not a productive fear, it's more of a paralyzing fear.
Well, there's just everyday anxiety. Missing the subway when you're late for work, trying to get to an appointment and you can't find a cab. It's just, the city is fraught with it.
The experience varies because anxiety occurs on a spectrum. At one extreme, it's a crippling disorder. At the other, a normal, even healthy part of daily life.
The anxiety is not all bad. Think about how in college did you keep yourself up late at night studying for that test to get a good grade? Actually, it was anxiety that got you to do that.
It's normal to be anxious, which is a form of fear. It's just a fear of what's going to come in the future. However, when that fear or that anxiety becomes disconnected from the situation, let's say there is no danger in the environment and you are still worried, still anxious, still fearful, that's when we are talking about anxiety disorders.
Sometimes I'd look at ordinary objects and it would cause me to be, just stimulate a panic response. I'd look at a teapot and be afraid of it. Why would you be afraid of a teapot?
I get the same kind of feeling someone would get waiting outside their exam room for the test, but I have it all the time.
If you can see the tiger through the brush and you're fearful, hey, that's a rational response. If you know that tigers have been dead for 1,000 years and you're still fearful of them, then that's anxiety.
I was watching a TV show and I saw something about someone choking and nobody did anything to help them, and it scared me. I went to bed the next night and then the next morning I was afraid to swallow. I don't know, it just freaked me out really. I couldn't eat because I was afraid I was choking and then I was gonna die. And then eventually we went to a psychiatrist and I was diagnosed with anxiety.
Today, people like Aaron and Lucas, who meet the criteria of an anxiety disorder, are most likely to end up on medication. But as the conversation about life's daily anxieties grows louder and louder, more and more people who think of themselves as normal are considering using pills to deal with everyday life.
For me, anxiety is not having control over my life in any environment. I'm at work and my shoulders are up here and I literally have to say, down, down shoulders, you know, because they're up at my ears. I don't know how I'm managing.
You're kind of not.
I'm not. I'm not. And especially when you have a 4-year-old, and you know we're looking into schools for her now.
And private schools.
We are looking into.
And is Alan working?
No.
Excellent. Wow.
Okay.
He was laid off right after the crash in 2008. So we have one income and a mortgage, and it's very difficult, especially living in New York City. There are a lot of people competing for your job. There are a lot of people competing for that seat on the subway. There are a lot of people who get to the farmer's market before you do and buy up all the corn that you were going to cook for your guests that night.
I heard a story about parents dropping off their kids and sort of clogging up the street in front of the school, and they weren't dropping off correctly. And eventually they had to be threatened with putting a mark on their child's permanent record. And this was a preschool.
I still sometimes have trouble sleeping, and I still sometimes have some hyperventilation. I have a lot of tension I clench my teeth a lot, and it's destroying my teeth. The traditional gender roles are kind of reversed in my household, so I think that's another thing that plays into it, is that, I'm not the mommy that a lot of other kids have. I'm the one who goes to work every day and that she sees basically an hour a night and on weekends. You feel completely helpless. You feel like you have no control over your own life.
We get ourselves into a situation where we think that we're rational and that we can have perfect control over our experience. And then when we lose control of that experience, which of course we're going to do because there's so many other elements involved, it's terrifying. We are pushing ourselves to the edge of our confidence and competency, and the result is that somebody who thought before, well, I'm going to be okay, I can just keep myself cool and collected, now they're so freaked out and so stressed that they're going to reach for, if they're offered, which they often are by a GP, they'll say, yeah, you know what, maybe I better take a pill, because I really need to keep my cool here.
According to the World Health Organization, disorders related to dread are now the most prevalent mental illnesses on the globe.
On the one hand, we all are anxious. Right now I'm anxious about whether my car is parked outside and is going to get a ticket or not. But anxiety is also a pathological emotion, and that is not a normal experience, because anxiety can be crippling.
I would get heart palpitations, this tightness in my chest, and not really understand what was happening, losing my breath. I just had no idea what was going on.
Swirsky with a nice chance as she moved in on goal to test Kendra Fisher.
Kendra Fisher was on her way to a spot on the Olympic hockey team before anxiety began to take control of her life.
It's this secret you want to keep and this thing that you don't want people to know you're dealing with. So to then have to try to explain to people why I wasn't okay going out for dinner, or I wasn't okay driving down the street, it got to a point where I wasn't okay leaving my apartment. I lost about 47 pounds in a month and a half. I couldn't eat, I couldn't sleep. I was just an absolute shell of myself.
When her condition became unbearable, Kendra was forced to retire from hockey just weeks before realizing her dream of joining Team Canada.
It was the one thing that I had spent my entire life wanting, and you know, where do you go after that?
Since touching bottom several years ago, a mixture of meds, psychotherapy, and lifestyle changes have steadied Kendra. But she's still unable to dine out in public or go to a concert without risking a serious attack.
Heaven forbid I forget to take my pills, and that typically makes for a rough day.
Today, an extreme case of anxiety like Kendra's is treated as a genuine psychiatric illness, while someone like Jessica, for now at least, falls just under the threshold of a disorder. What separates them is still, for the most part, a scientific mystery.
In the 17th century, if you were anxious or depressed, then it was thought to be the result of demonic possession. This then leaches away, and by the end of the 18th century, the population as a whole has stopped believing in demonic possession and has started believing in clinical medicine. Anxiety was seen as an aspect of psychotic illness. That means the presence of delusions and hallucinations.
Early cures varied from spa treatment to special diets, prayer, even fresh air.
But then the huge change in medical interpretations of anxiety comes with the psychoanalysts, comes with Sigmund Freud. When Freud says, yes, it is very much a disease of its own, anxiety neurosis.
Treatment was evolving too. Spas and physical therapies gave way to barbiturates that produced sensations from mild sedation to total anesthesia. These were the first psychoactive drugs.
Barbiturates, the sleeping pills, bear colorful names like goofballs, red devils, yellow jackets, blue heavens, and rainbows. Pet pills and sleeping pills, when improperly used, can be just as dangerous as taking dope.
By the 1960s, Valium-style drugs, the benzodiazepines, had taken over, partly because they were considered less dangerous. And since the late 1980s, the Prozac family of drugs, or SSRIs, have dominated treatment for anxiety. These work, in theory, by increasing the level of serotonin in the brain.
We have no idea how it works. Somehow you take it every morning and your anxiety goes away. What does it matter that we don't know how it works? One of the issues is that there are many side effects, and the less that we know about how drugs work therapeutically, the less we're going to know about how they may work to cause negative or adverse reactions.
For all of its many forms, anxiety is still not easy to see with the naked eye. Today, millions in research dollars are spent on neuroscience in the hopes of finding the next big breakthrough.
All right, so what we have here is we have an animal that's been implanted with fiber optics directed at a part of the brain called the hippocampus that we think is important for anxiety-like behavior. This maze measures the animal's innate anxiety and its innate fear of open spaces. When we keep the light off, the animal will behave like a normal mouse. It'll basically spend all its time in these closed parts of the maze. When we turn on the light and activate these specific circuits, the animal will now start to explore the open arms of the maze. So that suggests that we can regulate the animal's anxiety state. And so if we can discover new circuits in the brain, we can now create better drugs to alleviate anxiety in humans.
While researchers try to map anxiety in the brain, the search is on for the genes that trigger it all.
Psychiatric disorders run in families, and that basically tells you that there is a vulnerable genetic terrain in certain individuals. We are only at the top of the iceberg. We've found a few of the genes involved, but probably more than 90% are still missing.
For now, anxiety is understood basically as a list of symptoms, observed by patients and doctors and collated since 1952 in what's known as the Bible of Psychiatry, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, or simply the DSM.
The role of the DSM is really very simple. It's a long list of mental disorders, and it helps us to locate our patients within that spectrum of psychological suffering. We can't take a brain picture and we have no blood test to tell us, oh, yes, this is anxiety. We depend entirely on patients telling us how they're feeling.
The most important function of the diagnostic manual is to set the boundary between normality and psychiatric illness. Now, the trouble with this is that there is no clear boundary.
Already, vague definitions of anxiety in the DSM make it easy to overdiagnose.
Homosexuality used to be in the DSM.
Right, yeah.
15-year-old boy, so it's, girls.
In New York, Jessica Scott has been reading the DSM out of curiosity about her own anxiety. Tonight, she's decided to self-diagnose with her friends and see how many of them meet the threshold of an anxiety disorder.
Let's take a, I'm curious though, let's take a look in the DSM. This is the diagnostic criteria for generalized anxiety disorder, okay? So let's see what it says and let's see what we think about it.
Because now everything's a syndrome.
A, excessive anxiety and worry, apprehensive expectation, occurring more days than not for at least 6 months.
45 years.
That pretty much covers. All right, who wants to read the next two of these? Because this is giving me a headache. Restlessness or feeling keyed up or on edge. Check. Easily fatigued. Yes. Difficulty concentrating or mind going blank.
This is perimenopausal.
Yeah, well, that is also perimenopausal.
I wouldn't know.
Muscle tension, sleep disturbance, difficulty falling or staying asleep, all of the above.
Okay, so here's the thing. Everybody in the world has been
Yes.
experiencing
Anxiety.
Oh,
So what's the label that we're all experiencing?
well, for you, it's you're
Generalized
just...
anxiety. For you, yeah.
Using the DSM to diagnose anxiety at a dinner party is, of course, far from an exact science. But the same is true even for the professionals in a case where the patient is genuinely on the fence.
Can I turn left out of here?
Bike! Jesus. Oh, don't do this to me. Oh my God.
If I have to focus, I can't. I can't listen to anything. I can't have anyone talking to me. Oh, now I'm in. Driving is a big one. Like, everybody experiences anxiety over exams and stuff, but I think I experience it a little bit more. I don't know if it's a little bit more or the same, or I don't know if people are better at dealing with it than I am, or I don't know.
My name's Stephanie. I was wondering if I could talk to one of your counselors.
Sure. Anxiety on the campus is huge. We'll see in the neighborhood of about 11,000 students in health service. About 28% of all the students that we see have an anxiety disorder.
Little things will set me off. And my first lab of this year, I spilled reagents all over myself because I did my calculations wrong. And the worse I do, the more I freak out, and it just sort of compounds. And the fact that I'm even thinking about medication is strange for me because I don't like taking it.
Because we expect to be more happy and fulfilled than the average human life is going to be, we start to become open to the idea that our unhappiness is somehow pathological or a disorder, and that it deserves to be treated. And that's a real modern phenomenon, to take the complexity and enormity of human emotion and turn it into a treatable illness.
If you have an illness that can be corrected with a new boyfriend or a check for $5,000, then you probably don't have a psychiatric disorder at all, even though you'll be given a psychiatric diagnosis today.
I would definitely say most students were probably looking for an easy way out because there's so much that's expected of us. Like, a lot of people have a job while they're going to school full-time and having to pay off loans and things. And I know people that are getting second degrees, so they're paying off their student loans from before while getting more student loans. So I can see people like, well, I can take this pill and it'll be gone in 30 seconds, or I can do this exercise for 30 minutes. I can see why people would find that to be the easy way out.
They'll come in having researched on the internet. They'll read into what symptom profile they believe that they have, and they'll say, well, this is what's prescribed, this is what is recommended, and I'd like to get that. We have students coming in asking for specific drugs. So you seem a bit nervous to me even right today.
I have a little bit of social anxiety.
Yeah. They're overwhelmed. It's kind of this vague, overwhelmed. They feel that they can't meet their deadlines, that there's just too much work, they don't know where to start.
I can cope most of the time, or at least I try to, but it's getting to the point where it's too much and I can't.
What you have to realize is that it's in a continuum. There is the normal adaptive response, and when it gets exaggerated, you fall into the anxiety disorder. But there is an arbitrary cutoff between the two.
In the majority of cases in the anxiety disorders, all I have is your report to me. And so that creates a little bit of subjective problem.
Because of that subjectivity, anxiety is easy to overdiagnose. At the same time, GPs are often too busy to look beyond medication for the answer. Drug companies understand this better than anyone, and they spend a fortune marketing to doctors and consumers alike, trying to bring us all under the pharmaceutical umbrella.
It's like I can't participate in life. I'm too busy worrying. I don't sleep at night. Paxil works to correct this imbalance, to relieve anxiety.
I think what's happened over the course of the last 30 years is a kind of perfect storm in psychiatric diagnosis.
The most common symptoms include rapid heartbeat, trembling, sweating, tense muscles.
People have to understand that these diagnoses that one hears on every street corner are diagnoses that are being marketed for commercial profit. They don't necessarily correspond at all to what your underlying problem is.
Medicalization is a huge, huge issue, and psychiatry is the easiest area to medicalize because we don't have the biological gold standard.
The country is bathing itself in prescribed drugs. There's already an enormously high rate of diagnosis of anxiety disorders. In a recent study, it turned out that by age 32, 50% of the population might qualify for an anxiety disorder. Get that. Age 32, 50% of the population might qualify for an anxiety disorder.
To qualify, patients must meet the criteria published in the DSM. It's a document that is always being revised, often to include more and more symptoms and new diagnoses. It's a trend that worries former chairperson Dr. Alan Francis.
It seems like the system is way too loose already. And what DSM-5 is suggesting is to open the gates way wider and make it much easier to get an anxiety disorder. There's a new proposal for a diagnosis of mixed anxiety depression that would be, I think, very much equivalent to the everyday worries, tensions, stresses, problems that all people have. And this is likely to become, from nowhere, the most common diagnosis in psychiatry. This would be a needless increase of psychiatric diagnosis, a medicalization of normality, making pathological the worries and troubles that are a natural part of the human condition, and that we shouldn't turn routinely into a medical disorder.
One of the doctors charged with reviewing anxiety disorders for the new DSM is Helen Blair Simpson.
Mixed anxiety depression is a hotly contested issue. This is something that people worry about. And there's always that sort of balance between how do you make sure someone who's ill gets the diagnosis, and how do you make sure that someone who's not ill doesn't?
This session really continues the road to DSM-5.
Perhaps the most important psychiatrist in the world today is Dr. David Kupfer. As chair of the DSM-5 task force, he is the man with the final say on what will be and what won't be a mental illness.
What we all were asking ourselves to do was to basically look at everything that was in the DSM-4 and say, if it's working well, leave it alone. Nobody has been instructed to look for more disorders. We are making changes because we believe that it will serve us better in terms of dealing with patients and families.
I think that the DSM-5 has an important job to do, but it's doing just the opposite of what I would be suggesting. I think that the appropriate function of psychiatric diagnosis now should be to try to tame the tiger, to try to indicate in the manual with big black box warnings, this diagnosis is being overused. Here are the key steps to making sure that you're making this diagnosis appropriately. Instead, what DSM-5 is doing is opening the floodgates.
The number of diagnoses in the DSM system continues to increase. In reality, if you look at the different forms of illness, there are only 4 or 5 major forms of psychiatric illnesses. There aren't 400. This is a classic conflict between the splitters and the lumpers. The splitters are people who say we must make ever more finely differentiated distinctions among kinds of behavior that we consider to be pathological. The lumpers say, well, you know, there are only about 4 or 5 things that can really go wrong. I'm very much a lumper, but the future belongs to the splitters.
Imagine a society in which all the new disorders currently proposed for the DSM-5 were accepted and became real diagnoses to be used in everyday medical practice.
They'll go from period to period, from decade to decade, from saying homosexuality is a disorder to saying, you know, overeating is a disorder to saying whatever the thing of the day is that people are not necessarily comfortable with, that they may decide is disordered. So in this funny way, we've actually compartmentalized our entire sort of human personality into billable coding systems.
For example, my wife died on March 6th of this year, okay? I had a grief experience after that. The symptoms I had, couldn't sleep, didn't want to eat, felt a lack of energy, sad. Those are the symptoms of depression. Now, it used to be we said that after a year of grief, if you still had those symptoms, then you have a depression, not grief. What do we say now? We say if after 2 weeks of the death of a spouse, a child, or a parent, if you still have those symptoms, you can be diagnosed as having depressive disorder.
It's very clear to me that it's not a question that too many people are getting too much treatment. I think to some extent there are a lot of people who are not getting enough treatment, and I worry more about that, to be honest with you.
A new diagnosis in psychiatry is dangerous because tens of millions of people may get medicines that previously they wouldn't have gotten, and those medicines may not be helpful. The biggest beneficiary of diagnostic inflation is obviously the big pharmaceutical companies.
You'd have to be stupid as a manager in the pharmaceutical industry not to realize that your bread and butter is coming out of the diagnoses.
Thinking about what the pharmaceutical industry will do or not do is not primary on the agenda of the task force, the work group members, etc. We have no control over how, if you will, companies or researchers or organizations spend their money.
I think that's the disconnect. And they don't feel sufficiently responsible for the public health unintended consequences of the decisions they're making. They're thinking of the consequences only in their practice. They're not thinking about the unintended consequences in the real world.
Unintended consequences, like creating a disease where none existed before. That's the story of Paxil, notorious as the landmark case in the multi-billion-dollar game of drug marketing.
Well, it was orchestrated by GlaxoSmithKline's PR firm. It was a very concerted, very well-planned effort to publicize this disorder.
For some people, the fear of interacting with others, in fact, any social contact, is so acute that they go out of their way to avoid all social situations. This is a condition known as social anxiety disorder.
In the 19th century, shyness was a virtue. It was considered to be a sign of character and of a good breeding. In our times, shyness is a pathology, and we go to some length treating shy people as if they were sick. Well, are they really sick? Or has the pharmaceutical industry discovered it can make money off of treating shyness?
Well, the thought of public speaking can send butterflies for someone suffering from a phobia.
Tense muscles, upset stomach.
It can actually make living a day-to-day life almost impossible.
I remember seeing all these stories coming out kind of at the same time in many different publications, and it was about this social anxiety disorder. They all contain these fantastic statistics saying, what percentage of Americans suffered from this disorder in any given year. And a lot of them contain the same experts and patients talking about the disorder.
Studies have shown that Paxil can dramatically decrease the symptoms of social anxiety disorder.
And so I was kind of curious about, well, that's strange. All of a sudden, out of nowhere, all these stories start popping up at once. What's going on with that?
Brendan Corner began his investigation by trying to find out who was behind all these news reports he was seeing on TV.
When I would trace back the phone numbers they listed, I would see they would trace back to PR firms that just happened to represent GlaxoSmithKline, which was the manufacturer of Paxil, which just coincidentally had just been approved to treat this disorder.
Turns out, they weren't real news reports at all. Cohn & Wolfe, Glaxo's PR firm, was hired to produce a series of video news releases, easy enough to mistake for the real thing, and sent them anonymously to TV stations across the U.S.
The good news for the millions with this disorder is a medication called Paxil, just approved by the FDA. It is the first and only FDA-approved treatment for social anxiety disorder.
The company then hired, PR companies and other companies to encourage doctors to become, quote, educated, which was really marketing, and to encourage the public to reframe shyness into a disorder.
Paxil also developed a quite cynical strategy of ghostwriting, whereby they contacted physicians and helped them create stories that could be plugged into the medical literature. So they buy credibility by the use of an academic.
It's clear there was a lack of disclosure and real efforts on the part of the PR firm to obfuscate the fact that this was ultimately something propelled by a company looking to sell a product.
Before the publicity strategy started, there were 51 media stories around the world. 1 year after the campaign had started, focusing on the concept of imagine being allergic to people. There were 1.5 billion stories in the media. So it's remarkable how this became a kind of a societal concept.
GlaxoSmithKline's revenues jumped by 40% in 2001. They're not doing anything illegal at all. It's very clear that they're not breaking any laws that I'm aware of. I think the debate for people is ethics, which is a very distinct thing from legality.
As long as there is sort of an untapped market of patients running around out there who are not on your drug, you are going to be hiring the smartest marketing people in the world to figure out a way to convince those people that they have a condition.
They put up all these signs on bus shelters and on billboards, and there was this phone number on there you could call. And I remember calling it a few months afterwards, and you got this recording saying, "This campaign is successfully concluded." So they kind of wrapped it up pretty quickly and just said they declared victory and moved on.
Yes, Paxil is a remarkable success story in how a company has been able to market a product by the you could call it creation of a disease.
Most of the time, Mark, it's circumstantial, wouldn't you say, with the anxiety?
It's all situational. These things are all situational depression, situational anxieties, and they're treated with drugs instead of just trying to counsel and try to eliminate those factors that are causing it. It's the easy way out.
Yeah, it's like a crutch.
For the patient and the doctor.
Right. It's the fastest way to overcome.
Everyone's happy. The pharmacist's happy. Yeah. Everyone's happy, but the patient, is the patient well served? I don't think so.
No.
You've got a headache. Now I've got some strange disease, don't worry about it. This pill will set your mind at ease. It's called Progenitorivox. It's made by Squab Merle Co. It's a life-enhancing miracle, but there are some things you should know.
It may cause agitation, palpitations, excessive salivation, constipation, male lactation, rust-colored urination, hallucinations, bad vibrations, mild electric shock sensations.
But it's worth it for the drugs I need.
The thing I found is they do work, but they make everything very sort of an even shade of gray. Funny things aren't as funny. Sad movies don't give you goosebumps anymore. Poetry can't make you cry.
I was very disinterested in things I used to be really passionate about. And even my boyfriend, I wouldn't, it's like, hey, like I just didn't have that kind of attachment to anything. I felt really zombie-like.
They wind up placing people on these drugs without, for instance, any real sense of how difficult it is to get off them or what the side effects might be. And these drugs, you can gain 50 pounds, you can get diabetes too. Like, they're crazy side effects.
They're prescribed almost like candy, more by primary care doctors actually than by psychiatrists. I always have the impression that patients believe that psychiatrists are highly knowledgeable about the neurobiology and the underlying neurotransmitters, which are the chemicals in the brain that underlie mental illness. And I think it is surprising when they find out that we know very, very little about how these drugs work.
They would give you the sample packs and then prescriptions, and then when you told them how things were working out, they would recommend a different one and try this one and try this in combination with this. Even though it is fun to have someone who I tell all my friends is like Elvis Presley's doctor, it really isn't a good way to control it. It feels very artificial.
We didn't discuss cognitive behavioral therapy or any other kind of talk therapy that might help, or changes in, your diet or exercise that could help. It was straight to the medication and to a really high dose.
If the only tool you have is a hammer, then everything you see is going to look like a nail. And it's the same thing in psychiatry. If the only tool you have is a drug, then everything you see is going to look like something that's a medicatable condition.
Mental health has filled a whole space that in prior times was occupied by religion, morality, and by common sense. I feel there's a tragedy to this. This is a tragic story.
Social anxiety disorder is an intense fear of everyday social interactions.
That's really a life-impairing condition.
It's in the newspapers all the time. It's in the magazines. It's on the internet, the television.
Part of the reason anxiety seems to be prevalent is because it is prevalent, but another reason is because it's become part of our vocabulary to talk in psychiatric terms.
Come on up here, Christine.
So we identify ourselves as anxious in a way that we wouldn't have before.
I've been taking clonazepam lately for anxiety. Little blue pills that look a lot like birth control. This guy I was seeing thought I was super protected. I thought I might get pregnant, but I'll just be cool with it.
It was great. Yeah, it was really fun. Because it's taking very difficult situations and making fun of them. It gave me a really different perspective and sometimes took the anxiety away from situations and the fear, because I could just laugh about it.
I ordered a coffee at Starbucks the other day. I heard, tall, nutty one. I was offended. They just yelled out my diagnosis.
I don't think there's as much of a stigma as there used to be. So many people just openly discuss it now, and they just refer to their therapists as though they were at their neighbor's house last night. I was at my therapist's last night. There's really no odd response, because they're all in therapy too.
So we expect anxiety. Each of us gets the so-called medical student syndrome. You know what medical student syndrome is? When a medical student is taking a pathology course and turning the page and reading about a new disease, like let's say a melanoma, and all of a sudden as he reads, he looks at his hand and says, oh my God, I've got a mole there. That could be melanoma.
I'm sure that there's a cultural component too, because some cultures don't even have a word for anxiety. It just doesn't exist in certain cultures. It certainly exists in ours.
In fact, anxiety has become so much a part of the cultural discourse, anti-anxiety pills are now the inspiration for art exhibits.
They look great. I just want to make sure that our placement is basically how you want it.
Well, they're supposed to look like they just spilled out of a pill bottle.
We live in the age of anxiety. There's a correlation between anxiety, in my view, and advanced capitalism. The pills that you see are for anxiety and depression. And the thing that I really want people to do is to talk about this stuff, because it's a short-term fix for a deeper problem in our society. And I really do think we have to stop it. And if we just keep medicating ourselves, we'll just kind of, you know, fall asleep. And that'll be the end of us.
In the space of a single generation, anxiety has emerged from the fringe of mental illness to become completely mainstream.
You need to use both behavioral techniques as well as medication.
And what are the side effects of the medications?
Sometimes we get aggression, such as going down to the park and meeting a new animal instead of being calmer. The dog's a little more aggressive with other dogs. So let us know if that happens, but that would be rare.
One of my friends once told me, he said, Bill, we're living in an uninhabitable culture. No wonder you don't feel good. Whether it's any different now than it was through history, I don't know.
Back in the 18th century London, Boswell's London, believed that they were a fast-paced urban life on the Thames, and they were all just totally stressed out and so forth, and they made that responsible for their symptoms. So in a sense, there's nothing new under the sun here, and the idea that our lives have speeded up particularly so that now we're more anxious than ever before is just a canard.
People have gone through a lot of stuff in this life. War, famine, pestilence, whatever. It's like, come on, toughen up. I think maybe in the former generations that was more of the attitude. I know they didn't have the medications, weren't as good in those days. Fresh air and laudanum and prayer.
My mom, her generation, I'm sure, when she was growing up, wasn't something that you really considered for her, and it is a lot of, well, you know, walk it off or suck it up and that sort of stuff.
What has changed over the years, aside from perceptions, is the way mental illnesses are defined.
What's outside the human condition that's normal if all of this is, it needs medication or needs therapy or needs treatment?
Okay, so based on what we've all read today, Who has anxiety at this table?
Everyone.
For Stephanie, like so many university students, it's all about whether or not to medicate.
It's what I'm experiencing. Like, is it normal, I guess? Like, I don't know, is it, because I kind of feel like I'm freaking out a little bit more than most of my friends in my classes are, or I don't know if they're hiding it better or what's going on.
I would tell you it's fairly normal, what you're experiencing. Many students are experiencing. It's hard to be at university.
Instead of prescription meds, at least for now, Stephanie gets a list of lifestyle changes. No scary movies before bed, warm milk, hot bath, and doing some breathing exercises regularly.
One of the reasons I kind of go down this path is that a lot of kids your age think that coming and getting a pill is going to solve the problem, and it's a temporary solution. It really doesn't solve sort of some of the lifestyle changes people need to make to actually make themselves healthier. It's really some coping strategies that they need to develop that'll do them really much better in the long run than to just kind of mask the symptoms. Does that seem like a reasonable plan?
Yeah, definitely, especially because I don't like medication. So I'm glad that I have better options.
In some cases, however, there may be no better option than to medicate.
I get a lot of tension everywhere. Like okay, I'm anxious, sorry. Okay. I also am wondering if I should take a clonazepam. Okay, I can just express myself a lot better when I take my medication.
You know, everybody's scared to admit they're on them. For me, it's simple. I mean, if I had cancer, I would have gone on chemo. I would have done the radiation. I would have done what it was my doctor told me to do. It's what I take to stay well, and maybe that course of therapy won't always stay the same for me. Maybe someday that will change. Maybe someday I'll come off it. But in the meantime, I mean, I'm treating myself for something that makes me unwell, so I can't beat myself up for it anymore.
I think pharmaceuticals have their place. I mean, they've saved people's lives. And I don't think it should be the only route, and I don't think it should be the first thing that a therapist pulls out of their toolbox. And I think that's probably happening a lot. That's why I choose not to, even though it has been, it's been recommended sometimes, but that's my choice.
In most cases, there are other ways to deal with anxiety beyond taking a pill, including changes in diet and exercise. Mindful meditation has made its way into grade schools. Yoga is a global phenomenon.
So you'll start by just pressing the icon in the top left.
There's even an app
right
for anxiety.
To me, anxiety isn't something that you can just sweep under the rug. You have to deal with it. And I just have to remind myself to do that. So I try to take these little steps during the day where I just say, okay, I'm just going to breathe. I'm just going to breathe, and I'm going to shut my eyes, and I'm going to count to 5, and then start over. And that seems to help.
We all have to deal with it. Everyone has baggage that they have to live with through their whole life. Mine had to be anxiety.
But despite our best efforts to tackle anxiety, as long as psychiatry keeps expanding its domain, and drug companies go on treating your mental health like a business opportunity, we will continue to medicalize the human experience.
The biggest problem with being mislabeled with a mental disorder these days is that you're very likely to get medication. And in some instances, the medication may be remarkably harmful. Bottom line is that the manual of psychiatric diagnoses should be cautioning against overdiagnosis rather than encouraging it.
This is just a terrible development. If you include addictive disorders, they say 3 out of 4 people on a lifetime basis will have a psychiatric illness. Oh, that's crazy.
It's us, it's the doctors, because we're the gatekeepers of the drugs. We're the ones that write out the prescriptions. And one of the problems in psychiatry is that the pendulum has really swung far too far towards psychopharmacology or the use of medications.
What we are doing, more or less, is clinicizing human emotions. So we're taking the experience of being human in all its complexity and the way it used to be manifest in song and in scripture and in theater and in poetry, and we're turning it into a broken down piece of biology.